The African National Congress has already begun celebrating following its victory in the country's 6th general elections. However, there are those who believe that the hard work starts in earnest, more so that the country's President Cyril Ramaphosa has to make real the concept of Ramaphoria or dispel Ramaphobia. Bonolo Makgale from the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria joins us now in the studio for more. A very good evening to you, Bonolo, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Perhaps let's first start out with whether or not South Africans in general, all of them, have a reason to celebrate. Obviously, there were stable elections, free and fair largely, but generally, do South Africans have a reason to celebrate this outcome?
Well, I think the fact that South Africans voted, it is a sign of good democracy. So I think on a general point of view, yes, South Africans have a reason to celebrate. But of course, with a few dynamics that came out of the election, it might just be a cautious celebration because we aren't really sure of what the future will look like and what will unfold after this election. But I think there is a room for celebration, perhaps a cautious celebration of some sort.
And I'm just going to look at what some of the statements were that were made beforehand, that the fact that the markers were watching the election hawkishly to see whether or not there is a distinctive, or should I say, a convincing Cyril Ramaphosa win. What should we read into that? Is it a mark of stability or a mark of at least some sort of confidence in the trajectory that South Africa is not going to go on?
So it's an interesting thing. I think the win of the ANC is that particularly that it speaks of stable democracy. And I think the market is always looking out for stable democracy, because what it means for the market is that the market can potentially predict the direction the ANC will take in terms of policy. The market can almost predict the direction the ANC will take. And because the market already knows the ANC, the market already knows some of the things that Cyril Ramaphosa has been bringing forth in terms of the policy trajectory of the ANC. So it makes the market a little uncomfortable. It makes the market a little comfortable, because then they don't have to be dealing with an animal that they do not know. And if you think about it, the market has responded quite positively actually to the news of the ANC winning. So the sense of a stable democracy does something significant.
But I want to bring two thought processes onto the fore here. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm looking at Alexandra then with a different point of view of whether or not this is good for the country. And then there's a message of support on the victory of the ANC win from Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the UK. Some are saying it's nothing more than just a gesture. It's not going to bring about any changes in the financial market's view of South Africa.
So you do make a good point there. And I think if we are to look at the win of the ANC, particularly from a social point of view, it might mean that there will be persisting inequality. So we might continue to see what we saw happening in Alexandra in few weeks ago. We might continue to see persisting protest when it comes to service delivery. So on the one hand, from an economic perspective, the market is quite pleased with the win of the ANC. But on the other hand, it might mean that the levels of inequality might continue, because the ANC has proven that it hasn't paid particular attention in the levels of inequality in South Africa. I mean, if we think about it, the levels of inequality in South Africa are so high and higher than it was even during apartheid era. So if the ANC will allow itself to engage on the questions that South African citizens are having, questions around unemployment, questions of land, questions of service delivery, then maybe if there might be some change. But if the ANC would not be if the ANC won't pay attention to what South African citizens are saying, won't pay attention to the continued protests on service delivery that we're seeing, then things might actually stay the same. So the market might celebrate the sense of stable democracy, but South African citizens might continue to live in the kind of absolute poverty that we are seeing and persistent levels of inequality.
And I'm curious, there is something that people have been sort of lightly touching touching on. Some, I suppose, being afraid of being accused of being malicious or being facetious. Eskom, people have been saying we haven't seen any brownouts, blackouts, whichever way you want to call it, because of the election. Some even sinisterly saying that we're about to see them now. Is that implying that the expectations that Cyril Ramaphosa is going to come in with renewed effort to really rev up the engine of the domestic market, that may not happen because of those perennial problems that we have?
I mean, when we think about the president, I think that, so I have a cautious optimism when it comes to Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC and what they will do or not do, right? So on one hand, I kind of believe that Cyril Ramaphosa might bring some particular intervention that will bring some sort of change in the systemic issues that we've been facing in South Africa on inequality, unemployment, and injustice, and perhaps even find ways to restore and rebuild institutions within the states that are problematic, Eskom being one of them, and a few state-owned enterprises. So on the one hand, I want to be cautiously optimistic that might happen. But on the other hand, it could have been that the ANC was playing politics with us, you know. And so I think it's only a matter of time. We will be able to measure what happens when we see what continues. If corruption continues, if the Eskom problems continues, if the Transnet problems continues, then we would know that actually this was just the ANC playing games. But I think it might be too early for us to make that analysis, but also it might be too naive of us to think that the ANC will suddenly make huge interventions when it comes to...
I want to talk about another possible source of naivety, and that is Cyril Ramaphosa leadership in the face of geopolitics at the moment. There are those who said the fact that you've had Cyril Ramaphosa as a president now in the face of growing tensions between the United States and China whom we export to a lot, that he would be in a position to possibly influence some sort of coming to the table and talking and reaching a truce for which South Africa can benefit. Is it naivete, or does he have that much of diplomatic
I
thought?
actually think Cyril Ramaphosa does have the diplomatic capacity to do that. I think if we are to think of do an analysis of our previous leaders, I think without having to make specific naming and reflection on some of our previous state leaders, and I'm probably one of the people that are naive. I think when it comes to political conversation and positioning on South Africa in that light, I do think that Cyril Ramaphosa has the capacity to engage on that level.
And what about the reimagining of the relationships with the two, given the circumstances? Obviously, we're trying to improve and grow the free trade agreements with the rest of the region. But what conversations would we have with China, for instance, for greater transparency? If we're going to be affected by this tit for tat between the US and China, how would we then negotiate better deals for ourselves, for trade deals?
I mean, so the conversation about free trade and trade deals in Africa, largely, we've been having this conversation. I think African leaders have been having this conversation. Paul Kagame has been having this conversation,
but not with much success.
Not with much success. So I'm not quite sure what that would look like in the near future. I think, as I said earlier, that I think I'm probably one of the people that are operating on the assumption that the president does have the capacity to navigate through these complex
and it's important, isn't it, because we've been talking about the need to really latch on to the fourth industrial revolution and not be caught on the tail end of that. And that would affect us greatly if you look at China and their ability to help us, which is what they've promised to do. If this trade war continues and it disarms them as a developing country, which some say is not really true, that we don't really know the true state of China's assets.
And we don't really know what will come out of it. We don't really know what the future would look like, even when we think about this relationship between China, America, and where South Africa position in that whole conversation.
So earlier on, we were speaking to Owen Goma, an economist, looking at the latest unemployment figures, and he's saying we need to be a lot more innovative in terms of growing the small to medium enterprises. But what is within our purview to do? How can we be more innovative given the current circumstances?
So without having to think through what would it look like for us to be more innovative, every time when I think about unemployment in South Africa, I think the fact that informal sector in South Africa is not given much attention, I think that's one of the challenges that we face. If you think about emerging markets, for an example, you think about Nigeria, you think about India, everywhere you find young people trying to sell you things, right? And in South Africa particularly, the red tape that exists for small and medium enterprises, the red tape that exists for informal sector to actually enter the market makes it very difficult, and the informal sector is actually an alternative, I would think, for those that are unemployed. So I think South Africa needs to really think through how they widen.
So that would be more radicalized policies, for instance, that are more friendly towards entrepreneurship. We've been talking about reduction of data and, as you say, reducing the red tape. But that means taking a harder line with the bigger established companies, possibly raising taxes, do you think, for the rich?
Yes, possibly raising taxes, but possibly also finding, particularly for business, incentivizing business in ways in which how you could do things like business incubation, for example, opening bigger businesses, opening their doors to smaller businesses, and finding incentives for them to be able to do it, so that if they open their doors to smaller business, what will that benefit them? But also raising tax might be one.
As a final question I need to ask is, how do you do this without alienating big business? Also with ensuring that you're saying you're doing away with the lines of patronage, because that's how some people see it, that the only people who benefit from this growing economy are those who are in proximity of...
because the economy is exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So how do you do that convincingly, taking all of those things into account? And if you're South African right now, this victory in 2019 for the ANC, this could bring you closer into the economy, participating by removing this. How would we do that?
I'm not sure how that will look like in practice, but I think I would imagine that it will start from a policy point of view, and I think the ANC needs to, as the leading party, will have to allow itself to think critically on what are some of the most creative and innovative measures to put in place, and what are the most relevant policies they would have to put in place to ensure that the space is quite inclusive. So if there will be some level of growth economically, what will that look like for the mama that is in the CBD selling snacks and whatnot?
All right, thank you very much, Bonolo Makgale from the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly.